how's everybody doing? Welcome to our Friday Forum. We're going to have a really fascinating conversation today. Dr. Alison Greene is with us. I'm going to hand it on over to Stephanie Rolfe to provide that introduction, but I just wanted to say welcome to Millsaps. I'm Kenneth Townsend. I chair the Public Events Committee, which puts on this program, weekly Friday Forums. We're really glad y'all are here. Next week, we're off because it's the Friday before fall break, so we don't have a program next Friday, and then the Friday after that's a faculty meeting. So we'll reconvene for the Arts and Humanities Symposium the week of homecoming. So that's October 21st will be our next gathering. Again, welcome to Millsaps. Glad all of you are here and look forward to the conversation that we have ahead of us. So, Stephanie.
Good afternoon. I probably don't need this, but let me also welcome you. I'm Stephanie Rolfe, and I'm in the Department of History here at Millsaps. And I am thrilled to be introducing my friend and colleague, Alison Collis Greene, who is an assistant professor from Mississippi State University in Starkville. She's been there since 2010, and she has just finished the work that she will be presenting on today. So a little bit of background for Alison. She earned her undergraduate degree in religious studies in 2001 from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And in 2010, she finished her PhD at Yale University. Her book, which was published last year, No Depression in Heaven, The Great Depression, The New Deal, and the Transformation of Religion in the Delta, has been widely praised since its release. And the most recent of those was yesterday, which we're really excited about and so lucky to have her. And the timing of this is so great. She found out yesterday that she is the recipient of the Charles S. Sidner Award, which comes from the Southern Historical Association. And it is in recognition of the best book on Southern history published in the previous year. So please join us. These are available for purchase with cash outside in the lobby on the second floor. If you don't have cash, however, you can go to the Millsaps College bookstore and swipe your card. There are copies there as well, and I hope that you will. Alison, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thanks. I'm really happy to be here. If for any reason you can't hear me, just give a wave and I'll speak up or raise the mic a little or something. So I thought I'd talk about a little bit to start about the way the book changed as I wrote it. So I finished this as a dissertation in 2010, and between that time and when the book came out last December, both of my grandparents died, and my two surviving grandparents. And the book's introduction, if you look at it, opens with a little vignette about my grandmother. And you're not really supposed to do that as a historian, but I couldn't stop thinking about my grandparents' own experiences as I wrote the book. And so I probably also because I did most of the revisions of the dissertation, and I pretty much just threw the dissertation out and rewrote the thing. And I did that during a cold winter in Philadelphia, the one up north, the cold one. And we were there for a semester, and I wrote most of the book wrapped up in these old quilts that my great-grandmother had made that were sewn in feed sacks from the Great Depression. And so I spent a lot of time wrapped up in those Depression quilts, thinking and writing about the Depression and in particular the ways that my grandparents talked about the Depression. And the thing that my grandmother always said, and honestly, I just didn't really think it was that profound. She said, we didn't know he was poor. She'd say that all the time, and we just didn't know he was poor. How many of you have heard somebody say that or said it? And I thought about it, and I thought, well, there are a lot of ways that you can take that. There are a lot of things that you can do with that kind of claim, and in fact, a lot of people use that now to say, well, we weren't really. Like, things weren't really that bad. These young folks, they just want so much more. But that's not what my grandmother meant. She was not mean about the young folks. In fact, I think she said it not because she was proud, but because she was embarrassed. I grew up in the Appalachians of North Carolina in a town of about 200. I'm sure many of you know what it's like to grow up in a small town. Both my grandparents all my grandparents were from there. And she grew up during the Depression on a subsistence farm that did all right. They had a mule, they had a wagon. Her mom was a midwife. And so they were okay. And they could feed people who came to the house. But she had to quit school in 6th grade to take care of her mom who got sick. And she was really ashamed that she didn't get to finish school. And so part of her we didn't know it was for is just sort of a general kind of proclamation of her shame about her sense that she was ignorant. And it was her accent. My friends would come home from college and they couldn't understand what she said. And it was also because and I realized this as I thought about it more, my grandmother would talk about the Depression. My grandfather never did. And I only learned the stories of his family's experience in the Depression later. His dad gave up 2 of his own sisters to an orphanage because he couldn't feed them. My granddad didn't talk about that at all. And so I think part of what Grandma was doing too was talking about how much better she had it than others. She couldn't really complain because she knew that there were others, including those to whom she was married, who had really suffered. So I thought about my grandparents and what they meant and what they were telling me when they told me about their childhoods and their adolescence. And I thought about another story that I kept hearing in 2012. Franklin Graham summed this other story up in an interview, and he said, it's a little easy to pick on Franklin Graham, but I'm going to. He said, 100 years ago, the social safety net in the church was provided by the church. If you didn't have a job, you'd go to your local church and ask the pastor if he knew somebody that could hire him. If you were hungry, you went to the local church and told them, I can't feed my family, and the church would help you. The government took that and took it away from the church. And that was Graham's response to a question about support for the needy. It sounds kind of nice that you could just go to your church and get the help you needed. Kind of quaint, kind of like, I don't know, you might imagine the Depression if we never saw it. And I came to think about this story and others like it as a coherent narrative that I began to call the myth of the redemptive depression. I'm going to elaborate on what that myth is now, and then I'll spend the rest of the time I have breaking it down. That myth goes sort of like this. The greatest generation suffered through the ravages of the Depression, but they came out of it stronger and more unified than ever before. Maybe Roosevelt helped them back on their feet with works programs and Social Security for a minute or two. But then they pulled together and they lifted themselves still further, and they didn't need that help anymore. They fought another war and they won. They built cozy homes, they went to college, they raised families, they took those families to church or synagogue every weekend. The greatest generation, by this narrative, was independent and hardworking and grateful, but every generation of their offspring since has grown lazier and greedier than the one before it. I teach college students, and I'm awfully tired of hearing about how lazy and entitled they are, because they aren't. Thought about that too. This is the story that has emerged in contemporary political debates about social policy and the welfare state. It's a story that I argue erases the suffering and the sorrow of the Depression, and that negates decades of bipartisan effort to protect Americans from another Great Depression. It's a story that privileges the experiences of the white middle class and ignores the vast network of federal programs that enabled the rise of that white middle class. A rise that happened at the expense and on the backs of people of color who have historically received fewer federal benefits. The price of forgetting this history is steep. For over 4 decades after the Depression, Democrats and Republicans alike worked together to prevent another Depression. They built a welfare state that provided basic protections to American citizens, and in the 1960s, that welfare state lumbered towards a more equitable distribution of wealth as it responded to pressure from African Americans and women and immigrants and others. But then over the next 4 decades, the past 4, Democrats and Republicans have scaled back that welfare state instead and have erased and even reversed its efforts to close the gaps between rich and poor, black and white, and men and women. One of the most toxic elements of this myth of the redemptive depression is the argument that was advanced most fiercely in the welfare reform debates of the 90s And that's sort of like taken as obvious truth today among many conservatives, that the New Deal destroyed the careful and compassionate work of churches and voluntary associations. Franklin Graham wasn't the only one to say something like Franklin Graham said. Current Speaker of the House, Paul Ryan, said that same year in 2012 that the welfare state, this is a quote, dissolves the common good of society and it dishonors the dignity of the human person. Both Graham and Ryan borrow from the ideas of a historian named Margaret Olasky, who wrote a book called The Tragedy of American Compassion in the 90s. And basically he said there's this golden age of mutual concern and support among Americans that started in early America and lasted up until the 30s. And then the New Deal undermined Americans' inherent compassion and instead created an impersonal and permanent welfare state that left the poor helpless and dependent. Now, to make this argument, to say that this is what the New Deal did, and this was the prehistory of the New Deal, you have to believe two things about poverty and suffering. First, you have to believe that poverty and suffering represent individual failures rather than flaws in our political and economic systems. And second, you have to believe that only churches and voluntary agencies should get to decide who among the poor really deserves to have help, how much, and under what terms. The implicit answer, of course, is not many, not much, and only if we like them. So that's the rationale for those arguments. I think the rationale is problematic. They're also utterly historically insupportable. And they're based either on a deep misunderstanding of the past, a selective reading of sources, or sheer fabrication. So I spent about 10 years on this book, which I would have held up, I don't have it. I worked in a couple dozen church and state archives, and about an equal amount of both. I mean, this is really a book about churches and about politics. Worked up and down the eastern seaboard, and especially here in this region, because the book focuses on Memphis and the Mississippi and Arkansas Delta. In fact, the Kane archives of Mississippi Methodism here at Millsaps were one of the first sets of archives that I used. One of the most pleasant sets of archives I used. I read a lot of New Orleans Christian advocates. There's some great stuff in those archives. If you haven't been, you ought to. And some great folks there as well. So I've talked about the myth of the redemptive depression now and the support for it. This should not come as a surprise, but I'm going to spend the rest of my time talking about what I learned doing my research and peeling away this myth of the redemptive depression. To unravel that myth, you got to go back before the Depression. You got to go back to an era when there was no federal safety net, when the nation was supposedly flush and well, before the Depression upended American confidence in capitalism. In most cities and large towns outside the South, which are actually where Olasky focuses his work, by the turn of the 20th century, state and municipal agencies actually handled more welfare and social reform than churches did. Voluntary and religious agencies largely supplemented their work. This is state level, not federal level agencies. By any comparison to the 21st century, those agencies were quite small, but they still did most of the work to care for people who needed it. In the rural South and in many southern cities, however, municipalities and states did very little, and so churches did do the work that was done to help people in need. And I write about Memphis and the Mississippi and Arkansas Delta. I'm from North Carolina. I'm not from the region. I did live in Marion, Arkansas for a couple years. But it's a really interesting region because, I wanted to write, when I set out to write this thing, I was determined that I was going to pick one decade and I was going to write about everything. So I was going to pick up a decade and a place, and I was going to talk about everybody that lived in that place. So I had to have a place that had some diversity. And Memphis and the Delta are not only, you think of Memphis and Delta diversity as black-white, which is indeed important and was really important to what I was doing. There's also religious diversity. It's where the Church of God in Christ was founded. It's where Memphis was 10% Jewish, 10% Catholic. Jews and Catholics did a lot to take care of others, including Protestants. And so it was a really interesting region, and I wanted to write about both the city and the countryside. I thought, you can't write about the Depression in the city without looking at the country, or the country without looking at the city, because people are moving all the time. But I also have to find somewhere that even though people are moving, maybe they're moving within a contained region. And the Delta is kind of a pretty obvious rural, Memphis is called the capital city of the Delta. So this region made a lot of sense for a lot of reasons to look at what's happening to religious life in Memphis and the Delta. And indeed the book is about, what you hear me talk about today is largely kind of the structures that clergy demanded and that the New Deal created. But the book itself is very much about the ordinary people who endured the Depression in Memphis and the Delta, and the demands that they made, and then the suffering that they endured, and the sorrows that they lived through, and then what they made of them, how they tried to make sense of those things and build lives for themselves in a really tough time and place. So this is a small slice of that. Memphis in this by 1930 was just a mid-sized city. It was a region of wealthy planters and industrialists, of poor factory workers and farmers, of Protestants, Catholics, Jews, blacks and whites. And it was also a region that experienced the Depression really early. The other thing, every time I get on an airplane, somebody tells me, well, my people lived out in the country, they didn't even know there was a Depression. They knew there was a Depression. I promise they knew. We've forgotten it. This is part of the forgetting, but they knew. And they especially knew in Memphis and the Delta. The entire 20s were pretty much a disaster in Memphis and the Delta. Not just the 1927 flood, which we all know about, it was really important, but cotton prices had been falling up and down, and then they just tanked after the end of the World War. And so the 20s were already an agricultural crisis. The farmers and the working class didn't experience that famous 1920s roaring 20s prosperity. Instead, the 20s really created a growing chasm between rich and poor, especially in Memphis and the Delta. The wealthy did mostly fine, although cotton planters weren't so thrilled with the changes in prices. But so it's an interesting region too, because the Depression happened really fast. So let me back up a little bit again. The South's first serious, as a region, the first serious public aid in the South came during the Civil War and in its aftermath. And it came in the form of state pensions for Confederate veterans. So this was the first welfare program in the South. It was for Confederate veterans. States also funded prisons and asylums, and many cities operated poorhouses for the indigent and the elderly. Sometimes poorhouses were also available to African Americans, but not always. This was aid predominantly for whites. Between 1911 and 1930, most states established small mothers' aid funds. And this was a national effort to establish these funds. They came later to the South, but they did come. And they were designed to provide pensions so that widowed or abandoned mothers could take care of their children at home instead of institutionalizing them, which they often had to do, so putting them in orphanages. And again, Mother's Aid only supported whites. It also only supported a few hundred families across Memphis and the Delta. It was really hard to get Mother's Aid. It was on a county-by-county basis. Most counties didn't offer it. And when they did, it was a couple dollars a month. So it was more sort of a nod to the need rather than an actual provision for it. And before the New Deal, that was it. That was all the public aid that you got in the Delta. Memphis had a milk truck that was privately funded, but they provided the transportation for the milk to families that needed it. That was about it, and a couple hospitals. So again, that's sort of the backstory. By 1930, private charities, most of them religious, accounted for 76% of per capita expenditures on relief in Memphis and almost 100% in the Delta. So this is the region. If you want to say that you got to find somewhere that there's private charity doing stuff, this is it. This is the region. Between the Civil War and the Great Depression, Protestant women's societies and home mission organizations built schools and hospitals and orphanages and settlement houses to reach mostly needy whites in the city and occasionally African Americans in much smaller numbers. Of course, they served only those that they thought were deserving and appropriately deferent, and people had to do things in order to receive help. Concerned that their members not be deemed a burden on the larger Protestant community, Catholics and Jews created charities to serve members of their own communities first, but were actually much better than most Protestants at serving those outside their communities as well. Black churches and fraternal orders provided the only source of support for most African Americans in need, and they established schools and medical facilities and insurance programs in both the city and the countryside. Yet the need that these organizations sought to alleviate outpaced the resources that they could gather even before the Great Depression. For families that didn't need institutional help, they didn't need an orphanage, they didn't need a settlement house, they instead faced chronic poverty and hunger, there really wasn't much help at all. Some ladies' aid societies would hand out coats or firewood. The Salvation Army in Memphis offered a comprehensive soup kitchen. It was the only place in Memphis to do that in the 30s. But the Salvation Army served primarily, although not exclusively, white men and boys in Memphis. That was the focus of the Salvation Army in Memphis in particular. People in the countryside outside Memphis relied entirely on informal aid, or they went hungry. And there are extensive state-level nutrition studies in the 1930s that demonstrate unquestionably people went hungry, people were malnourished, and were dying of malnutrition in the 1920s and 1930s in Mississippi, black and white kids. Pictures of them, their legs bowed with rickets. And those studies were actually conducted at Mississippi State by a nutritionist named Dorothy Dickens, if you're interested. So it could look. So there were constant requests and support for these underfunded voluntary societies, like the Memphis Community Fund, which organized all the charities in Memphis, would reach out to people all the time asking for help. They published all these flyers and pamphlets showing all of the things that they did. If you lived in Memphis, you would think anything you possibly needed could be met in this 30-page flyer. It looked really good. The stories, there were all these sweet stories of the families that were helped, whose lives were turned around forever. So you could get the impression from these pamphlets that anybody who needed help just had to go ask. But if you look at the numbers and the proportions of people helped, turns out not so much. And that's before the Depression. That's before disaster struck. The 1929 stock market crash didn't immediately affect Memphis and the Delta, but a record-setting drought in the spring and summer of 1930 parched the cotton in the fields, and the prices for what remained dropped to a third of the previous year's rates. If you were growing cotton in 1930, you were out of luck. And other places that didn't have a drought were doing fine, much further depressed the cotton prices here. Or the cotton prices everywhere, what we could get here. Food crops didn't survive the drought either. They struggled alongside the cotton, so farmers who would have put away food for the winter, not all could, but those who could faced the long winter with neither food to store nor income for basic staples. Then, as if that wasn't enough, a wave of bank failures that was in part, although not entirely connected to the stock market crash, swept the region, and even those who had managed to put by a little money saw their savings disappear. You could be doing everything right, you still were going to lose everything in many cases. After several delays, long delays, President Herbert Hoover dispatched the Red Cross to provide disaster aid, but this crisis was only the first of many. No one yet had a name for it, but the Great Depression had begun. And the Red Cross actually was much more willing. So the Red Cross would provide seed and animal feed, but they wouldn't provide food for people until the very end of their aid program. It was a part of their self-help idea, but it's hard to plant your seeds and feed your animals when you're starving. So the private aid organizations that had proudly proclaimed their success at caring for anyone who really needed help suddenly faced three crises at once. First, the number of people who wanted help skyrocketed. Second, the defense that many of the poor deserved whatever they got fell apart in the face of widespread environmental and economic crisis. You didn't hear much of that language in the 1930s. In fact, you heard people saying, we were wrong. These people are not responsible. This is systemic. And last, donations to charities and churches plummeted. Any savings, when banks fail, churches and charities have their money in those banks too. They lose their savings as well. And the same bank failures that crushed farmers and the middle classes. Churches and charities did try to help. The story is going to get a little brighter from here for a minute before it Gets less bright again. Churches and charities tried to help. They did. In December of 1929, the Salvation Army in Memphis served 1,700 meals. In December of 1930, the Salvation Army in Memphis served 6,500 meals. In April of the same year, it served 10,250 meals. So you see the number of people served increasing tenfold in just over a year. And this isn't because the Salvation Army had more resources, it's because the need was so intense in this moment. The Salvation Army was also a men's shelter in Memphis, and it had a pool, and it drained its pool and put pallets on the floor to house all of the people who couldn't find a place to live and sleep in Memphis. You have people sleeping in the Salvation Army's pool floor. So the Salvation Army managed to do more. Most other agencies cut back. They did less than they'd ever done, just at the moment when people needed more than they'd ever needed. The Memphis Community Fund, which organized charity in the city, which I mentioned before, cut back its fundraising goals by about 30% and still came in 24% short in 1931. With two of the women's clubs who did the most charity work in Memphis shut down. Fraternal orders, as I mentioned before, and particularly for African Americans, fraternal orders were one of the central sources of support. Many of those fraternal orders were not able to survive the Depression either because they depended on mutual aid. Well, mutual aid doesn't work when everybody's broke at once. Other quasi-religious private organizations also suspended their work or disbanded. So at this moment, when you have the most need, you have the fewest places to go. Churches, as institutions, as churches, fared still worse than charities. They struggled in many cases just to keep their doors open. And you see desperate pleas in all these denominational papers for supporting a minister. They can't even pay their clergy. Between 1929 and 1932, just to give you a little context, national income dropped by more than 50%. Wage earners' income sank by 60%. Salaried workers' income sank by 40%. Because of the drought and the lost cotton crop, all of those things were more dramatic in Memphis and the Delta. Those are national percentages. Up until 1933, even in the face of all of this crisis, church giving actually held steady as a proportion of national income. So it dropped by those same percentages, but it didn't drop more until 1933, and then it actually began to drop more precipitously than the national income. But that's still a 50% loss, just the moment when people need the most. And so demands on church resources are up, and what the church has is down. More ominously, the churches cut their benevolent spending first. It was the first thing to go. As the president of the Cash-Strapped Southern Baptist Convention put it most eloquently in 1931, "We're putting off the Lord's cause while we try to settle with our other creditors." When the money ran out, the churches turned their spending inward to themselves, not outward to help others. As they faced the suffering before them and their own inability to alleviate it, even conservative religious leaders joined social workers and hungry Americans to call for federal intervention. Charles Lee, who was the head of the Memphis Community Fund, a businessman, a self-identified conservative businessman in Memphis in the 1930s, excoriated wealthy residents of the city of Memphis who refused to help when they could, and he was quite sure that there were a lot of them. Lee knew his audience, and he wrote to the city's businessmen who still said, so Memphis made a stand. Memphis said the only way to end the Depression is to plow more money into business. So they held this big cotton carnival, they held this big festival to get people to buy more cotton. It didn't work. So Lee writes to these businessmen and says, I am heartily in favor of bigger and better smokestacks, of more beautiful and taller skyscrapers, of ribbons of concrete threading our country from coast to coast. The more the better. But man or city which becomes intoxicated for the possession of these, while hunger dwells unrequited, while the lives of little children are blighted for want of chance, is a man or city in which life becomes a hollow mockery, and which ultimately loses the material things he has grasped as he has sloughed off the spiritual. Even as he pleaded for donations, Lee went on to say that private agencies could not alone handle the burden of relief, and he called for federal relief programs. This was a noted turnaround for Charles Lee. And this was happening all over the South. In January 1932, in response to some of these calls, Hoover's administration established the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which Congress authorized to provide emergency loans to banks and corporations. That July, Congress expanded its powers to provide loans to states and municipalities for public work projects, to employ out-of-work citizens. Most states didn't take them because they couldn't pay back a loan. Yet the measure did little, because of that, measure did little to stem the deepening depression. So, Democrat Franklin Roosevelt trounced Hoover in the 1932 election, largely on the promise that he would use the power of the federal government to address the depression. Hoover continued to say that he wouldn't, even as the RFC was kind of doing some of that. The barrage of legislation that Roosevelt signed in 1933 and what would become known as his first 100 days in office included the creation of the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, or FARA. It was the first federal program to put federal funds not only towards employment relief, but also towards direct aid for the suffering, with the condition that it was administered locally and in whatever form city and state aid administrators saw fit. You can imagine the kind of conditions that white Southern aid administrators put on it. And this was a constant tangle, actually, between the head of FARA and aid administrators. Hopkins, the head of FARA, was determined that it would serve everyone. And this was an ongoing battle between the Roosevelt administration and the South. FARA was also the program that most directly engaged with the work once conducted, or at least claimed, by private aid organizations and churches in the South, because it did provide this direct relief. Government aid quickly, and FARA was temporary, it ended quickly. Government aid quickly outpaced that of all private agencies because it could leverage a vastly larger pool of resources. Because instead of just asking for money, relied on taxes, among other taxes, and including a tax on liquor, which came back, which was the one thing. Mississippi went 96% for Roosevelt, and almost every preacher was pretty gung-ho for Roosevelt, except they were really mad about prohibition, all sorts of interesting ways that they would say, he's right about everything. This is the most religious, they would say this over and over, the most religious administration in history, except this one thing that we're really still kind of mad about. But they still voted for Roosevelt. Or at least they said they did in surveys. Across the nation, but especially in places like Memphis and the Delta, that had always offered very little to the people who needed the most, New Deal spending made previous contributions look like pocket change. At the peak of private giving in 1931, Memphians raised 88 cents in aid per person, and 75% of that was private. The rest was the hospital and milk fund, and Mother's Aid, and Confederate pensions that was left. By 1934, so 88 cents, 75 cents of that is private. By 1934, 3 years later, the New Deal in full swing, Memphians received $7.21 per capita in aid for direct and work relief. And work relief is part of what makes those numbers higher. Private contributions that year amounted to only 12 cents per capita. So we go from private aid is 75 out of 88 cents to 12 cents out of $7.21. That's 1.6%. By comparison, the average aid per person in the nation's 116 major cities went from $2.36 a person, so it was more than Memphis to begin with, 45 cents of it private in 1931 to $16.51 per person in 34, with only 15 cents of that private. So this is clearly a dramatic reversal. In just 5 years, as federal dollars provided the work and the food that Memphians so desperately needed, private aid dropped from nearly 3/4 of relief spending to less than 2%. So the shift from private to public responsibility for the needy could have hardly been more dramatic. And so private aid is actually dropping when we're in the middle of a depression. But it's not dropping nearly as significantly, right, as public aid is increasing. The swing from private to public aid is a whole lot easier to track in the city, but it was even more dramatic in the countryside, where fewer resources of either kind had been available before. In the Delta, neither public nor private charity was organized enough to provide accurate reports before 1933, but by the end of July of 1933, FARA had made grants to every state and to the District of Columbia And between January of 33 and December of 35, 11 states, including Arkansas, Mississippi, and Tennessee, and most of the South, received more than 90% of their total work relief from the federal government. The states provided some. On the surface, it seemed that the federal government had swept in to take over the church's work in dramatic fashion, and there were a few people who complained about this early on. Certainly, the federal government quickly replaced local churches as the primary source of support for people in need. But by 1933, when this began, the limited aid that churches had offered before the Depression was already gone. Relieved of a burden they couldn't bear, and grateful that the state had heard their pleas for help, religious leaders across the theological and denominational spectrum and all over the nation celebrated the New Deal. Liberal Protestants unsurprisingly applauded FARA, as well as the National Recovery Administration, which for the first time acknowledged workers' rights to organize as a realization of the social creed of the churches. Catholics linked the New Deal programs to papal decrees regarding social justice and workers' rights, and Jews pointed to the connections between the New Deal and the teachings of ancient Israel's prophets. Conservative Protestants applauded the New Deal too, enthusiastically. They declared that Roosevelt, in fact, drew his inspiration straight from the Bible. One of them called him Moses. And I'm going to use this example. I've chosen a lot of Methodist examples since we're at Millsaps, and a lot of examples out of the archives here. The editor of the New Orleans Christian Advocate, which covered Louisiana and Mississippi, in this period was a guy named D.B. Rawlins. He was a big New Deal fan. And he wrote after in reference to the NRA's, the National Recovery Administration, the original NRA's symbol, the Blue Eagle, he wrote, "I have signed up for the war against the Depression." And then he wrote all about it in one of his front page editorials. People who once would have sought aid from religious societies began to turn to the state rather than local religious groups for material aid and personal guidance. And some clergy were very concerned about this. Others were quite grateful. A Sunday school superintendent, a Baptist Sunday school superintendent in Arkansas, wrote to something called the Welfare Society in Washington. There's no Welfare Society in Washington, but he wrote to the Welfare Society to ask for help with a pair of tough local children. They were causing trouble, smoking, getting kicked out of school. If you have a place for such lads to have them reformed, he wrote, the community would be much pleased. He was almost certainly disappointed when Eleanor Roosevelt wrote him back to say that the federal government could do nothing to address these two delinquent locals, as that would come, as she put it, would come under the jurisdiction of local authorities. So you get this really interesting moment when the burden of need has shifted from the churches, which were never really designed to handle it, but doing something, to the state, which was doing a whole lot more. And for the most part, you get really enthusiastic celebration of that. You clergy writing to Roosevelt saying, there's a minister in Memphis who kept a list of every member of his church who needed something, whether he thought they really needed it, and their physical and material condition. Some of these clergy wanted to have a hand in handing out federal aid, and when they didn't get to, they were kind of mad. And others were just really glad it was happening and wanted to help in any way that they could. And so there's thousands of these letters to Roosevelt that really provide a lot of insight into what people were thinking. There were even more letters because 2 years later, after Roosevelt signed the Social Security Act, and established the Works Progress Administration in '35, the largest works program in the nation's history, he actually wrote a letter. He reached out to clergy to assess their responses to the New Deal and the extension of a permanent federal safety net. And he specifically asked for feedback on Social Security and the WPA. Over 30,000 clergy across the country responded, and because the Roosevelt administration enumerated everything, they actually enumerated all the responses that came in here in September, all the responses that came in by November. An administration official actually wrote on each one of them, this is a positive response, a negative response, or a mixed response, and then the mixed responses were mixed positive or mixed negative. And then they tabulated what all of the responses were. And there were, of the 30,000 that came in, 12,000 came in time for this extensive tabulation. And if you look at all the responses have these marks on them, they're not really trying to fudge it. They're pretty honest about, yeah, this guy's enthusiastic and this woman's really not. 84% of those letters were either favorable or favorable with some reservations, and almost always those reservations are about prohibition. And sometimes reservations that were, well, we really like these programs, but don't go too much further. More often, there were reservations that were like, well, we really like these programs, but you haven't gone far enough. And that was also considered favorable with criticism. And that was a really widespread criticism in this period, including from Mississippi Southern Baptists. The New Deal doesn't do enough, not that it's too much. The editor of, again, another Methodist example, the editor of the Christian Advocate in Nashville, the South's major Methodist journal, wrote to Roosevelt, above all else, as I see it, is your Social Security program. For the first time in our history, we have a national administration that is seeking to realize practically all the objectives of the social creeds of the churches, Catholic, Protestant, and Jewish. So for religious leaders like this one, the welfare state represented a religious achievement, not an encroachment on the church's work. It freed the churches to focus on the supplementary care to federal care, or to return to a focus on evangelism. Now, of course, there were dissenters. Premillennialists included Roosevelt among a cast of possible antichrists, and a growing group of white Southern conservatives worried that the New Deal would undermine Jim Crow capitalism, and also that the government's moral authority might supersede theirs. African Americans petitioned for protection from racist Southern aid administrators, and some agreed with other Christian and Jewish socialists, a small, but not that small, and very visible presence in the South who wanted a president to unmake American capitalism, not revive it. But the New Deal consensus thrived in the South, and from the 40s to the 60s, both Republicans and Democratic administrations gradually expanded the welfare state and its protections for American citizens. When civil rights activists protested unequal benefits the welfare state provided to whites, Lyndon Johnson's administration responded with the War on Poverty, and its programs were designed to expand provisions for health and child welfare across racial lines. It wasn't perfect, it was far from perfect, and it was met with fierce resistance, but it nonetheless represented the most equitable expansion of the welfare state and the most equitable distribution of aid in the nation to that point. Yet conservative repression of the civil rights movement and a concomitant backlash against federal protection for all Americans was already underway. By the 80s, the war on poverty somehow instead became a new war on the poor, and a common term and an apt term I think that you'll hear, which was a renewed effort to blame the poor for their own suffering and deny them the very services that had proven an effective road out of poverty. 4 decades of efforts to both shrink and privatize the welfare state and remove federal oversight of capitalism have resulted in another period of vast income inequality, this one, unmatched since the 20s and now since the 19th century. So this work to dismantle the welfare state rests on this myth of the redemptive depression. You can't do that unless you create a story that lets you. It's a careful erasure and repackaging of the 20th century's greatest economic crisis, which infuses Americans' contemporary faith in the voluntary and private sectors and skepticism of the federal government. In this retelling, people who wanted help could always turn to their families or their churches until Roosevelt stepped in, messed everything up with state aid that made people hopelessly dependent. One of those catastrophic moments in modern American life got rewritten as this idyllic world where the deserving poor left to their own devices would find their way out of misery with just a little help from their churches and none from the government. Gone from this myth of the redemptive depression are years of suffering so deep and so widespread that they left once hopeful Americans defeated and their churches and communities unable to come to their aid. Gone are the clergy bold enough to admit defeat and call for a social safety net that would prevent the men and women before them from dying of starvation and diseases of poverty. Gone are the careful negotiations between church and state and the willingness to try new solutions to economic and social crises. What remains is a nation haunted by a past that it refuses to remember. Thanks.
Thank you, Allison. Now we have a few minutes for questions.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for your talk.
Yeah, thanks.
the state is intervening by not letting capital flow the way it naturally should flow, and if those two myths are related in the ways that you're reading them.
Let me make sure that I understand you're asking about the connections between this kind of narrative about federal aid for people who needed it and a narrative about the regulatory state, a narrative that if you just left it alone, it would have been fine.
Yes.
Yeah.
So if we let the state give,
Sure.
the state also
It's like the business version of the same narrative, right? I mean, they're intimately related, right? So a part of the New Deal were all of these new regulations designed to prevent all of the things that caused the Depression, and I hope I'm answering. Then keep pushing me if I'm not the question that you're asking. But they're certainly they're very much connected. It's the same. I mean, they are. The critique of the regulatory state and the critique of the welfare state are both critiques of the use of government of government, right?
So in the midst that you're reading, are we talking about the story over and over again? Do you see the regulatory state?
Well, yeah. I mean, so basically, let me just sort of go. This kind of myth of the redemptive depression is the idea. And again, this is where, because I'm a religious historian, is the idea that the Depression was redemptive. Like, it was just bad enough that people hurt a little bit, and that kind of pain and sorrow brought them together and made them better people and tougher, stronger people, so that they might have needed a little government help for that, but they didn't really need anything beyond that. I mean, so the regulatory state is not directly a part of that, but I mean, it's certainly connected. I don't know that I could draw the same kind of myth out. We certainly could, I guess.
I was born in Madison County, near Camden, in 1928. I experienced a lot of all of this, okay? And I won't elaborate too much, but I was in, my father was in the county welfare. I think they were organized about 1936. And he made one visits to determine people's eligibility for old age assistance, because the only place for old people in our community was the courthouse. And it's hard to describe how terrible it was. Okay? I will say this, he wanted to get everybody on that he possibly could benefit from it. So the attitude there was try to help people. I didn't see the regulations then. He was feeding people and making quilts for people. They would have a quilting day at the community, at the gym, at the school. And people would come in and make their bed things, stuff to go on their beds. There was some regulation once you got into distributing money, you had to make sure that you got to people who were eligible. And those are the regulations. I don't know if I understand all this about regulation. I think we've overdone that. Personally, we have to have regulations if you're going to give people funds and resources.
Yeah, and I think you're asking about sort of business regulation in particular. Is that right? So it is. So that was done under it's a different set of programs. Although, I mean, there's definitely overlap. So, for instance, there were a couple of instances in Mississippi where the works programs actually turned out to be basically factories trying to get. I'm trying to remember where this is, but basically putting people to work for nothing. So they were sort of taking advantage of what was actually inadequate regulation. But that's more within this sort of welfare program as opposed to business regulation.
My parents were not active church people. One set of grandparents were, and the other one set were not. Okay. But I don't recall churches in our community being involved in any of this. They didn't give away anything.
Yeah, individual churches very often didn't.
Maybe the cities they did.
Yeah. So.
But people were hungry. People were hurting bad. And it wasn't until Roosevelt was elected that things became that. Okay.
Yeah, individual churches very often did very little. Denominations did more, right? And they had these institutions, like Mississippi had a Baptist and a Methodist orphanage and a Catholic orphanage. But really it was institutional care of that sort. There were most of the denominations had built hospitals, but in terms of just helping people, there was a Presbyterian church in Greenville that was really proud to have pulled together a ladies' aid society that was really proud to have pulled together a grand total of like $50 for the year, and that was a lot for them. So we're talking about very small levels of church aid, and most of them couldn't. And one of the things that I write about in the book is that churches are not. It's not like churches where people who needed help were full of other people who needed a lot of help. Churches were divided by class and divided by race, and so the churches that were doing fine were often pretty insulated from people who weren't. The Depression kind of changed that, but they stayed insulated as long as they could.
Go ahead.
Is it more about human behavior? Is it really ridiculous? Or is it more about me and mine? In other words, it's okay for me to need that at my time, and then knowing that that's what helped me, I don't want someone else to receive me because I know that it will help. So I kind of withhold that because I'm not the one necessarily needing the benefit at the time. I mean, humans were like that, right? Me and mine, my time. Because if you look at the Dust Bowl out in the West, isn't it the same approach about those people at that time and we don't want them, they don't need help and blah, blah, blah.
I think there are two things going on. One of them is that the kind of aid that helped the people who would become most critical of aid was the least visible aid. So for instance, Social Security was presented, the term entitlement meant something very different in the 1930s, and Social Security was an entitlement. You paid into it, you got what you paid. It wasn't, nobody was giving you anything, right? And that made Social Security enormously popular. It was a very conservative program, really. Social Security benefited white men disproportionately because women were working more than ever in the 30s, but often not in professions that were included. Southern Congress people made sure that agricultural workers and domestic workers were excluded from Social Security, and that meant the exclusion of African Americans and poor whites. So you got a series of, and then even with aid to widows and children within Social Security was less privileged than retirement aid, and you had to prove you deserved that, where you didn't for retirement aid. So the kinds of aid that would benefit the people who become most critical of it, you can talk about stuff later with like GI Bill and housing aid, which went almost exclusively to whites. We're talking about that a lot right now. All of those things, people just can't. People didn't associate them with the government or don't anymore, or they see those as something they deserve, whereas this other kind of aid is undeserved. And there were some really problematic choices made in the creation of Social Security and a lot of these programs that created these kind of two divergent paths. And so I think that's part of what's happening. Well, that happened because of the ways that people thought about race and gender in that period. And so when in the 60s, when the war on poverty actually tries to address the needs of women and people of color, then you get a lot more complaints about it, and that's when you get the me and mine and not you and yours. But it's not just about like that has a lot to do with race and gender, and less to do with just this person versus that person.
Other questions?
Not a question, but just an observation that growing up hearing people talk about Roosevelt, very admirably about the New Deal.
Can you speak up?
When hearing people talk about the New Deal and Roosevelt, who was considered a world hero, anything that was wrong with that was generally attributed to that woman, Eleanor. You know, everything was fine. Anything that was wrong with it was because of her.
In part because she was, although tepidly, she was an advocate of civil rights. So there were rumors of Eleanor clubs, right, which were supposed to be clubs of African Americans organizing for things. So yeah, that's a really good point to make. But also people in Mississippi, especially women, wrote to Eleanor Roosevelt too, and it's very interesting the kinds of different things that they wrote to one versus the other for, and they're much more much chattier in letters to her as you might expect. I mean, people just write her to say hi, right?
You had a question?
No. I mean, there were people who, there were a lot of people who were concerned about, aid creating dependence. This language was there. It wasn't, but it wasn't the people who were getting the help. And you didn't find many people who said, no, I can go it on my own. I didn't come across many of those, because this was a moment when you couldn't go it on your own. When you couldn't. That's why you get this dramatic change in attitudes. Go it on your own, die under a tree somewhere.
Presley, did you have a question? Did you have a question?
Oh, me.
Oh, I thought I saw your hand go up. Sorry.
Yeah, it's okay. Maybe I was just wondering about the sort of beginnings of this. You call it the myth of retentive depression. Is that something that you see beginning around sort of the 60s when we're trying to expand the people who are included in these systems, or is that something that comes later in the 80s and 90s when some of this history is being written?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, I mean, you can find kind of threads of it in earlier New Deal critiques, but it really builds steam in response to the Great Society, again, because of the Great Society's attempts at inclusiveness, as imperfect as they were, and in reaction to the Civil Rights Movement. And, I mean, you will have people directly saying, white people in the South directly saying, I would rather nobody have it than let African Americans have it. So, I mean, this is part of, not the entirety of, but part of how that reversal gained steam, and then it really took off in the 1990s in those welfare reform debates, which trucked in the same language, right? I mean, they pulled out all of this language about the welfare queens and used that to critique the much less significant provision of aid that went to people who needed it than went to, say, businesses.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Did you have any cause to look at sermons, or did you have access to anything? I mean, what is the narrative that pastors and ministers are using during the Great Depression?
That is a great question. I looked at a lot of sermons, and I mean, it's kind of hard to find. Like, the sermons that I really wanted were sermons out in, some small church somewhere, and you don't get a lot of those. But of the sermons that I could find, Methodist, Presbyterians get the most, unsurprisingly, some Baptists. There is astonishingly little talk about the Depression between 29 and 31. I mean, it's just people are, and one of the book doesn't get to the New Deal until the fourth chapter, because I spend a lot of time just talking about the Depression and how bad it was, and people didn't know what to say. They didn't know what was happening. They didn't know it was the Great Depression. I mean, you never use that word, but I mean, they didn't know what it was going to be. They were just stunned. Everybody kept saying it was going to get better. You get over and over every year, like, it's going to be better next year. It's going to be better. It's almost over. And it wasn't, and it just kept getting worse. And so for like 3 years, there's just this kind of spinning wheels and just shock, where I don't know what we do. And so you had clergy finally, during the campaign year, talking about the Depression in some ways, you got a lot of revival talk. Like, we just need a revival of religion. If we have a revival of religion, everything will be okay. We just have to, the Presbyterians declared 33 or 4 their year, like a revival year, evangelistic year, like a special revival year, I can't remember what they called it. And a lot of churches did that. So there's this emphasis on revivalism. And then you get kind of a response to that saying, well, that's great, but we also need the federal government to help people who are starving. But you don't get much of that in the pulpit. You get it in denominational papers, but sermons are, here's the scripture, here's the message, could have been the same. I kept even looking for kind of indirect. Well, they talked more about poverty this year. Not really.
Programs is because it helps white men over other demographics. Would you argue that FDR's New Deal was so impactful not because of the welfare provided at the time, but because it set a new precedent for local programs in the future?
Yeah, sure. And that precedent, it's a complicated precedent, right? It set the precedent that the federal government is responsible for addressing the needs of the nation, which wasn't clear before. But it also set precedents that further privileged people who already were better off. But at the same time, Roosevelt backed down in a lot of cases to Southern politicians, but at the same time, the New Deal, there were programs that were, so a guy named, let me give you an example. Let me finish that sentence. At the same time, the New Deal also provided for African Americans more than had been the case in the South, although utterly inadequately, and also created a place to go outside the sort of the local administration. So there's a farmer, a black farmer, who wrote to Roosevelt about the whites who took the title to his farm, and Roosevelt responded to him, and he got his farm back. And so everybody wrote about this, and they would write to Roosevelt. And so there was this idea for the first time that there was recourse, there was somewhere else to go, and there's someone to hear your grievances, and that those grievances were valid. And so there's a ton of letters to the administration showing that. So it's a checkered legacy, but there's some really important stuff that happened out of it as well. And then there were programs like the Resettlement Administration and then the Farm Security Administration, headed by Will Alexander, who had worked with the Southern Tenant Farmers Union and Interracial Union, and was really determined, and not always successful, but really determined actually that resettlement was still segregated, but that resettlement would resettle people in proportion to their representation in the population. So if there were going to be 3 white settlement communities in a town or in a state with a 30% black population or a third black population, then there had to be, if there's going to be 2 white ones, there's got to be a black one, right? So there were efforts, and this was what really incensed the Southern politicians, the sense that there was any sense of equity there, even though it was utterly inadequate. So it's complicated.
Some of the farm programs were really drawn to assure that tenants, sharecroppers, would get a share. That was abused considerably. I can say from my own knowledge.
Yeah.
Another thing that was abused was the sharecropper got an allowance. It was called a draw on the first Saturday of each month. And then that was added up. It was supposed to be taken out of the sharecropper on a grown. A lot of unfair settlements resulted. The farmers took advantage of tenants, many of them. I'm not saying all of them.
Indeed.
Many did, okay? But there was a lot of fine homes built in the South and in Mississippi from those funds that were literally stolen from the tenants. Okay?
It was, so one of the AAA, which was supposed to, the Agricultural Adjustment Act, which was supposed to address some of these issues, there was no provision for equitable distribution of those resources. So basically, planters got the money and then kicked off a lot. They would even just kick people off. And there was no, they said, oh, well, we're going under, we got to save ourselves. And there was no protection there. In fact, the Farm Security and Resettlement Administrations were responses in large part to those abuses that really that were not top down. The Southern Tenant Farmers Union fought really hard for that and advocated for those programs and were really influential in making them happen. But yeah, yes, absolutely, you're absolutely right. It's pretty horrifying. And there were black and white tenants in this period.
Yes.
Sometimes on the same farms, often on different farms.
Well, I think that just about does it for this Friday. Thank you to Alison Greene for being here. And as a reminder, if you have cash, the books are for sale and on the second floor lobby. They're also available in the Millsaps College bookstore if you're like me and you never have cash on you, which is over in the Student Center, first floor. You want to announce next week? Or we're off next week?
Yeah, we're off for the next couple weeks. See y'all back on October 21st. So have a good couple weeks.
Thanks to all of y'all for coming. I really appreciate the chance to talk to all of you, and thanks to y'all very much.